Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Shattered Grove. Holly Arnold was no stranger to the Isle of Wight. She had explored nearly every inch of its coastlines, its cliffs, and its rolling hills. Yet, there was one place that had always eluded her, a dense, shadowy forest in the island's interior, said to be untouched by time. The locals called it the Shattered Grove, a place whispered about in tales too strange to be true. But Holly had always had a taste for the unknown, and on this grey autumn afternoon she decided it was time to uncover its secrets. The path leading into the forest was narrow and overgrown, as if nature itself sought to hide the way. The towering trees seemed to close in around her as she ventured deeper, their gnarled branches forming a twisted canopy above. Holly had a map, but it was of little use here. The deeper she went, the more the landscape seemed to shift, as if the forest were rearranging itself to confound her. The air grew colder, and a deep silence settled over the woods, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. The trees grew taller, older, their bark dark and cracked, giving them the appearance of ancient sentinels. Holly felt their unseen eyes upon her, watching her every step. Hours passed, and the light began to wane. Holly was beginning to think she should turn back when she stumbled upon a clearing in the heart of the forest, bathed in a dim, unnatural light. The ground was covered in moss so black it seemed to absorb all light, and at the center of the clearing was a grove of trees unlike any she had ever seen. Their trunks were impossibly slender, rising like dark spires into the sky, their branches twisting and intertwining into an intricate lattice above. But it was the shadows that held Holly's attention. They did not behave as shadows should. They flickered and swayed even when nothing moved to cast them. They stretched and shifted, sliding across the ground and up the trees, as if alive with a will of their own. Holly's breath caught in her throat as she watched. One of the shadows detached itself from the ground, slithering toward her like a serpent. She stepped back, her heart pounding, but the shadow followed, its ink-eye form rippling as it moved. She turned to flee, but more shadows emerged from the grove, surrounding her, their dark tendrils reaching out. Panic surged through her as she realized there was no escape. The shadows coiled around her legs, pulling her down into the mossy earth. She struggled, but the more she fought, the tighter their grip became. Her screams echoed through the silent forest as the shadows dragged her toward the grove. As she was pulled into the darkness, Holly's mind was filled with glimpses of other lost souls trapped in the Shattered Grove for eternity, their bodies twisted and merged with the trees. The shadows fed on their despair, their pain, growing stronger with each new victim. Holly's vision blurred as the shadows wrapped around her, pulling her deeper into the cold, unyielding darkness. The forest closed in around her, and for a moment all was still. Then, slowly, the shadows retreated, leaving no trace of Holly Arnold behind. The grove stood silent once more, waiting for its next visitor. Years passed, and the stories of the Shattered Grove faded into legend. But the forest remained, a dark, silent sentinel on the Isle of Wight, its secrets hidden in the heart of the ancient woods. Those who dared to venture too deep never returned, swallowed by the shadows that moved with a life of their own. And deep within the grove, the trees whispered with the voices of the lost, their shadows dancing in the dim light, waiting for the next soul to join them in the eternal darkness. Years after Holly Arnold's disappearance, the tale of the Shattered Grove evolved into a local myth, a cautionary story told around campfires by those who dared speak of it. The islanders spoke of a cursed place where the natural order of things had been twisted, where darkness itself had been corrupted into something hungry. Most dismissed it as nothing more than folklore, a chilling tale to frighten tourists and children. But there were always those who felt the pull of the unknown, and despite the warnings, some could not resist the lure of the forbidden. One such person was Edward Lawson, a young historian with a fascination for local legends. He had heard the stories of the Shattered Grove and was determined to uncover the truth. Edward had always been skeptical of ghost stories and superstitions, believing that every myth had a kernel of truth buried within it. He was convinced that Holly Arnold's disappearance had a logical explanation, one rooted in reality, not the supernatural. On a cold morning in early November, Edward set out for the heart of the forest, armed with a camera, a journal, and a small pack of supplies. The sky was overcast, and a fine mist clung to the air, shrouding the forest in an eerie haze. As he made his way down the same narrow path that Holly had taken years before, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The deeper he ventured, the more the forest seemed to change around him. The trees became taller, their bark darker, and the undergrowth thickened, making it difficult to push forward. Edward noted this in his journal, remarking on the peculiar atmosphere that seemed to pervade the air. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crack of a distant branch or the rustle of unseen creatures. Finally, after what felt like hours, Edward stumbled upon the clearing. Just as the stories had described, it was a patch of forest unlike any other, a circle of impossibly tall trees, the spindly branches forming a twisted dome overhead. The ground was covered in that same black moss which seemed to swallow any light that touched it. But it was the shadows that drew his attention. They moved in ways that defied all logic, slithering across the ground and up the trees as if they were alive. Edward felt a chill crawl down his spine as he watched the shadows pulse and shift, their movements too deliberate, too purposeful to be the mere tricks of light. Despite the creeping dread that gnawed at him, Edward forced himself to step closer. He raised his camera and snapped a few photos, determined to capture the strange phenomenon. But as the flash illuminated the grove, the shadows recoiled violently, twisting and writhing as if in pain. The darkness seemed to thicken around him, and Edward's heart began to race. He turned to leave, but the shadows moved faster. They lunged at him, snaking around his legs and pulling him to the ground. Edward thrashed and kicked, but the shadows held tight, their grip like ice-cold iron. Panic set in as he realized that the stories were true, that this place was no mere legend, but something far darker and more terrifying. Edward screamed for help, but his voice was swallowed by the forest. The shadows coiled around him, dragging him across the mossy ground toward the center of the grove. His hands clawed at the earth, trying desperately to find something to hold on to, but there was nothing, only the cold, unyielding darkness. As he was pulled into the grove, Edward saw them faint, ghostly figures trapped within the trees, their faces twisted in eternal agony. He recognized Holly Arnold among them, her eyes wide with a terror that had never faded. The realization struck him with a brutal finality. The grove was not just a place of shadows, but a prison for lost souls, their essences bound to the forest for eternity. The shadows tightened their grip, and Edward's world went black. Days later, a search party was organized when Edward failed to return from his expedition. The islanders who joined the search were reluctant, their footsteps heavy with the weight of the stories they had grown up hearing. But they combed the forest nonetheless, hoping against hope that they would find some trace of the young historian. They found his journal, half buried in the dirt at the edge of the clearing. The last entry was scrawled hastily, the ink smeared as if written in a panic. "The shadows are alive. They are coming for me. God help me. I can see them. I can see the faces in the trees." But of Edward himself there was no sign. The clearing was empty, the grove silent and still, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. The search party, unnerved by the eerie quiet and the oppressive atmosphere, quickly retreated, taking the journal with them. In the weeks that followed, Edward's disappearance became yet another ghost story tied to the shadowed grove. The locals spoke of him in hushed tones, warning others to stay away from the cursed forest. But as time passed, the story, like Holly Arnold's before it, began to fade from memory, becoming just another tale to frighten children. But the grove remained, hidden deep within the forest, its shadows waiting patiently for the next soul to wander too close. And deep within the trees, the faces of the lost watched in silence, their eyes filled with a sorrow that would never be soothed, their voices forever trapped in the whispering wind. The forest knew no time, no change. It was eternal, as were the shadows that dwelled within it, and so it would remain, a dark secret in the heart of the Isle of Wight, waiting for the next curious soul to venture into its depths, unaware of the fate that awaited them in a shadowed grove. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.